Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a sledgehammer to one of the most iconic images in our collective imagination.
You mean the geologic column?
Exactly, that neat, color-coded stack of rock layers. You know, the bottom is simple and old, the middle is dinosaurs, and the top is us.
Right. It's supposed to be the history of life on Earth, written in stone.
That's how we learn it. But today, we're looking at a snack of sources that claim the book is being read, well, completely backwards.
Or at least that the pages are glued together in a way that doesn't make physical sense.
Yeah, we're analyzing a manuscript by Dr. Emil Silvestru, a geologist and cave expert, alongside a transcript from a pretty technical lecture on the fossil record. And their thesis is, it's aggressive.
It is. The central argument here is that the fossil record, far from being the slam dunk for Darwinian evolution, is actually its Achilles heel.
So they're saying the rocks don't point to eons of time.
They're saying the rocks point to a rapid catastrophic event. We're talking speed versus time. We're going to look at data points that suggest sudden appearance, biological material that really shouldn't exist if these rocks are millions of years old, and missing links that, according to these sources, are still very much missing.
It's a lot to unpack, so let's start with the basics. Segment 1, what actually is a fossil? Because I have this cartoon in my head where a dinosaur dies, sinks into the mud, and millions of years later, voila.
Museum exhibit.
Right.
That is the just so story. But the sources point out that from a geochemical perspective, fossils shouldn't really happen under normal conditions. Think about it. When an animal dies today, say, a deer in the forest, what happens?
It gets messy. Scavengers, bugs, bacteria, it rots. It's gone pretty quick.
Correct. It disappears. It doesn't sit there for 10,000 years waiting for dust to cover it. The source material emphasizes that the existence of a fossil is, by definition, proof of a disruption.
A disruption in the normal cycle of decay.
Exactly. To get a fossil, you need what geologists call taphonomic speed.
Taphonomic speed. Okay, break that down for me.
Taphonomy is just the study of how organisms decay and fossilize. And the golden rule is burial must happen before decay. You have to seal the organism off from oxygen and scavengers immediately.
So like a mudslide or a flood.
Perfect examples. And Dr. Silvestri points out that we have modern cases where fossilization, the actual mineralization, can happen in just a matter of months if the conditions are right.
But wait, if the fossil itself requires rapid burial, what does that imply about the rock it's sitting in? We think of those layers as forming super slow.
That's the logical pivot point the sources make. If you find a fossil inside a sedimentary rock layer, and that fossil had to be buried instantly to be preserved,
then the rock layer itself must have formed quickly.
It has to have. It couldn't have accumulated grain by grain over an epoch, or the animal would have dissolved long before it was covered.
So the layer is a snapshot of an event, not a calendar of an era.
Precisely. The sources connect this to catastrophism, specifically referencing the biblical flood model. The argument is that these vast sedimentary layers represent a massive watery event that laid down sediment incredibly fast.
It's interesting. The sources bring up William Strata Smith. He's the guy who mapped the layers in England, right? The father of geology.
He is. He created the first true geological map. But the sources make a key distinction between his method, which was just tracking where things were, and biostratigraphy, which came later.
Okay, what's the difference?
Biostratigraphy uses the fossils to date the rocks based on the assumption that evolution has already happened.
So it's circular. You use evolution to date the rocks, and then use the rocks to prove evolution.
That is the source's contention. They argue the physical evidence, the burial mechanics, points to catastrophe. But the interpretation has been forced into a gradual timeline.
Okay, so the rocks themselves might have formed fast. Now let's look at what's inside them. This brings us to the Cambrian Explosion. The sources call this Darwin's dilemma. Why is this such a headache for the standard model?
Because it breaks the pattern. Darwin's theory relies on slow, incremental changes. A worm gets a slightly harder skin, then a shell, then legs, and millions of years later you get a crab.
But the Cambrian doesn't look like that.
Not at all. The sources use a great analogy. Imagine the history of the Earth is a football field. The beginning of the planet is at one end zone, we're at the other.
Okay.
Now walk all the way down to the opponent's 12-yard line, you've walked 88 yards. Most of history is gone.
And what's happened so far?
Mostly single-celled organisms, maybe some sponges. But then in a span of just 4 inches on that field, boom.
4 inches, that's it?
4 inches.
Yeah.
In that tiny sliver of time, almost every major animal body plan, or phyla, appears. We're talking mollusks, echinoderms, arthropods, complex eyes, nervous systems, digestive tracts. They just show up.
Out of nowhere. Without ancestors.
That is the explosion. There is no gradual ramp-up. It's like an empty stage to a full orchestra in a split second. And the sources quote Darwin himself on this. He was honest about it. He admitted this was a valid argument against his views.
I've heard the counter-argument, though, that the ancestors were just soft. Too squishy to fossilize, so the record looks empty, but it wasn't.
The standard soft body defense. And it sounds reasonable until you look at the actual rocks. Dr. Silvestru refutes this pretty aggressively.
No!
He points out that in those same Cambrian layers, and even older ones, we do find fossils of soft things.
Like what?
Fossilized jellyfish, worms, even fossilized impressions of raindrops and sand ripples.
Hold on. If you can fossilize a raindrop, which is just water hitting sand, you should be able to fossilize a proto-trilobite.
That is the logic. If the camera resolution is high enough to capture a jellyfish, it should have captured the ancestors of hard-shelled animals if they were there. The fact that we don't suggest to the authors that they simply didn't exist.
Which brings us to another phenomenon the sources talk about. Stasis.
Yeah, living fossils.
Yeah.
Stasis is basically the opposite of evolution. It's things staying the same for a long, long time.
And the problem is, why? If the environment is changing, shouldn't they be evolving?
Exactly. If evolution is driven by adaptation, ice ages, meteors, continental drift, why didn't these creatures change?
So give us the big examples.
Well, stromatolites are the oldest. These are blue-green algae colonies. The sources say they appear in the record 3.5 billion years ago. And you can go to Shark Bay in Australia today and see living stromatolites that are basically identical.
3.5 billion years with no changes. That seems impossible.
It defies the expectations of genetic drift. But it's not just algae. Look at the horseshoe crab. Unchanged since the Ordovician period, 445 million years ago.
My favorite is the coelacanth. I love that story.
The coelacanth is the Lazarus of the ocean. It was supposed to have gone extinct 65 million years ago with the dinosaurs. But more importantly, it was called a transitional form.
A fish with legs, right. I've seen those diagrams.
Scientists saw its bony fins and fossils and theorized they were becoming legs, that this was the guy walking out of the ocean.
Until 1938.
Until a fisherman caught one off South Africa, alive. And when they watched it swim, it wasn't walking. It was just a fish, a deep-sea fish. It hadn't evolved, and it wasn't a transition.
The sources also mentioned the dinosaur tree.
The Wollemi pine, found in Australia in 1994. Before that, only known from Jurassic fossils. It's the same tree. So the question is, if the environment changed enough to kill the dinosaurs, why did this tree, the coelacanth, and the horseshoe crab stay exactly the same?
It really highlights the lack of those transitional forms Darwin was looking for. And that's a huge part of this deep dive, the hunt for the missing links.
It is. The sources argue that what we see is variation within a kind, but not between kinds. You can breed a wolf into a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. They're all dogs. That's variation. But you don't see a dog turning into a cat.
But what about Tiktaalik? That's the famous one. The fish with the flat head and the whisk-like fins. The bridge from water to land.
Tiktaalik is the poster child. But the sources point out a massive chronological problem that usually gets buried in the footnotes. It's called the Zakomy footprints.
Zakomy?
It's a quarry in Poland. Paleontologists found preserved footprints of tetrapods, four-legged land animals. The problem is the dating. These footprints are dated to 395 million years ago.
And how old is Tiktaalik?
About 375 million years.
So the land animals were already walking around 20 million years before their supposed ancestor even existed.
Exactly. If fully formed land animals were already there, Tiktaalik cannot be the ancestor. It loses its status. It's just a unique fish that lived at the same time.
That completely messes up the timeline. What about whales? The whale series, that's always presented as the perfect sequence.
It is, in museums. But the sources break down the actual fossils, and they claim it's a lot of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
Take Pachycetus. It was first announced based only on a skull. They just drew the rest as a semi-aquatic creature.
And when they found the rest of the bones...
It turned out to be a land animal, a running creature like a rat wolf, not aquatic at all.
What about Rhodocetus, the one with the flippers and tail?
The discoverer later admitted he didn't actually find the tail or the flippers. He inferred them because he believed it was a transition. It was an artistic reconstruction, not fossil reality.
Wow. That's kind of wild. It seems like a lot of filling in the blanks is going on.
That is the core critique. And then there's Quahila, claimed as a walking seal. The sources point out the skeleton is nearly identical to a modern river otter. So is it a proto-seal or just an otter?
So we have missing links that aren't linking, but then there's the opposite problem, fossils found in the wrong place. The sources call these offset fossils.
Right, anomalies that disrupt the geologic column, for instance, the Salt Range in Pakistan.
What happened there?
You have layers of salt dated as Precambrian, extremely old. But inside those layers, geologists found fossils of oak trees and insects.
Oak trees in the Precambrian. That's like finding an iPhone in an Egyptian tomb.
Pretty much. The standard explanation is that the wood fell into cracks. They call it intrusive. But the early geologists who studied this site insisted the wood was embedded, part of the original formation.
And the sources mention pollen too in Venezuela.
The Roraima Formation. The rock is dated at 1.8 billion years old. But they found pollen from flowering plants inside it. Flowering plants shouldn't exist for another billion years.
So either the rock dating is wrong or the plant timeline is wrong.
Or both. And then my favorite anomaly, dinosaurs in the sea.
Like swimming T-Rexes.
No, that's the point. We find fossils of hadrosaurs and ankylosaurs heavy, land-dwelling dinosaurs buried in marine sediments like chalk. Ocean graveyards.
How does a land dino end up in the middle of the ocean?
The source's theory points back to the flood model. A massive washout. They call it bloat and float. Carcasses of land animals are swept out to sea, they sink, and get buried with clams and sharks. It suggests a mixing of ecosystems during a chaos event, not separate eras.
Okay, I want to pivot to what I think is the most jaw-dropping part of this stack, the soft tissue.
This is the paradigm shift. In 2005, Dr. Mary Schweitzer was working with a T-Rex leg bone. She had to break it to get it in a helicopter. When she got it to the lab and dissolved the minerals, she found soft, stretchy tissue left behind.
We need to be clear here. A T-Rex is supposed to be 68 million years old.
At least. And biological material collagen, blood vessels, red blood cells is unstable. It degrades. It shouldn't last thousands of years, let alone millions.
But she found tissue you could pull with tweezers?
Yes. It was elastic. It snapped back. And since then, they found it in hadrosaurs, triceratops, and others. It's not a one-off.
And the sources say they found DNA too.
That is the real kicker. A 2013 study is cited that found dinosaur DNA and histones.
What's a histone?
It's the little protein spool that DNA wraps around to fit inside a cell. Finding them implies the DNA structure was preserved.
But doesn't DNA have a shelf life?
It does. It has a half-life. Even frozen, DNA falls apart. Yeah. Dinosaurs lived in warm climates. The source argues that finding detectable DNA and proteins is a chemical impossibility if the bones are 65 million years old.
So what's the implication?
The argument is straightforward. If the chemistry says thousands of years and the geology says millions of years, one of them has to be wrong. The sources argue that biology trumps the geology. The bones must be young.
It's amazing that isn't bigger news. It forces you to rethink the whole clock. Speaking of which, let's talk about us. Humans. The tree of life for humans is usually that neat line from ape to modern man.
The famous March of Progress image. The monkey hunched over, then standing up, then carrying a briefcase. But the sources argue the reality is less of a tree and more of a messy orchard.
It does seem like every other year a new ancestor gets dunked.
The track record is spotty. The sources highlight some famous errors. Piltdown man soul, a total fraud, a human skull with an orangutan jaw, fooled scientists for 40 years.
And Nebraska man.
Oh, that one's a classic. They found a single tooth in 1922. From that one tooth, they illustrated a whole primitive ape man and his family.
And the tooth was from Huff.
The pig. An extinct peccary.
Ouch! But beyond the hoaxes, the sources really focus on Neanderthals. They were the ultimate cavemen.
Right. But modern genetics has flipped that script. We now know, thanks to the Neanderthal genome, that they interbred with modern humans. Many of us carry Neanderthal DNA.
So if they could have babies with us,
then by the biological definition of species, they are us. They were fully human. The source argues they were just a different family group of Homo sapiens stockier, adapted for cold, but not a different species.
So the ape men move into the human column. What about Lucy?
The sources classify the Australopithecines as extinct apes. They point to the inner ear structure, the long curved fingers for climbing. They argue you have apes and you have humans, but the bridge is constructed from questionable fragments.
There's one question that always comes up, though. If humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, why don't we find their fossils together?
It's the most common objection. The sources explain this using the logic of the flood model. First, the numbers. 95% of the fossil record is marine invertebrates. Clams, corals.
So it's mostly just seashells.
Mostly. But second, it's about ecological zonation. Humans and dinosaurs probably didn't live in the same neighborhoods. You don't live in the swamp with the alligators.
Fair point. I try to avoid that.
And in a rising flood, humans would be mobile. we're smart. We'd flee to higher ground. A heavy dinosaur or a clam gets buried first. The argument is the separation in the rocks reflects a separation in habitat and instinct, not a separation in time.
So let's step back. We've analyzed fossils that demand speed to form. We've seen complex life appearing out of nowhere. We have living fossils that refuse to evolve.
And we've seen missing links that turn out to be false alarms and dinosaur bones that are still biologically fresh.
It suggests that the standard evolutionary narrative, the icon of the fossil record, is not as robust as the textbooks claim.
The data seems to support a narrative of sudden appearance, stasis, and catastrophic burial. It's a perspective that definitely shakes up the timeline.
It's fascinating to think the rocks might be telling a story of a massive rapid event rather than a slow, quiet history.
And that is the value of a deep dive like this. It challenges us to look at the physical evidence, the hard data, and ask if the story we've been told is the only one that fits.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. If the primary physical evidence we have, the rocks and the fossils, show sudden complex life and biological material that shouldn't survive deep time, does the entire timeline of history need to be reevaluated? Are we looking at a history book that was written in days, not eons?
It certainly raises an important question about how we interpret our past.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fossil record. It's been a rocky ride, but we hope you dug it. See you next time.